So, I want your ideas, or I want ideas that you have heard others say. This is going to be brainstorming. And the rule about brainstorming is there's no judgment. So just shout out. How are we going to fix poverty, friends? Come on. Money.
Rich people give money.
Rich people give money. Hang on. Give money. I heard sell pumpkins. Thank you very much. Universal basic income. Education. What about healthcare? Universal healthcare. What else? Jobs. Sorry? Fix education. Fix education system.
Everybody get along.
Everybody get along. Housing. Who's going to provide the housing? Taxes. Taxes maybe here, right? Taxes going here maybe. What else? Food. Food. Feeding the hungry. Love that. Sharing. Mercy.
Want to.
What else have you heard? What about poor people? Empathy. Oh, man, you guys are... I think I'm already preaching to the converted here. Fix corruption.
Compassion.
Sorry?
Compassion.
Okay. If we must.
Love. Recognition.
Recognition of.
The problem.
Drug addiction. Yeah. Mental health. Okay. All right, did we do it? Off to a good start. So, here's the thing I kind of want to play with, is the extent to which the ideas we have about how to fix poverty, get in the way of us doing something about poverty. I'm going to introduce to you an idea. Everyone ever heard the word alibi? Anybody also like a British mystery fan like I am? Right? So if somebody has an alibi, it means they didn't do it because they weren't there, right? If the murder happened in the library and you have proof that you were in the kitchen, then you could not have possibly done it. So we often talk about an alibi as proof of absence. You physically weren't there, therefore you cannot be guilty of the crime. There's also an idea of alibi as an evasion of responsibility. A different idea that I could not possibly be responsible for what happened, not necessarily because I wasn't there, but for some other kind of reason perhaps, or this has nothing to do with me. It's a different way of being absent from the crime. And I think this might be a helpful way of getting at what is actually going on in this parable that Jesus is telling us today, because it's a complex, it's a dense set of symbols and images that he is playing with in this parable, right? We've got the poor man who has died, who did not even, longed for, but would not even get the scraps from the rich man's table sitting right at the rich man's gate, right outside of his door, while inside the rich man is feasting sumptuously, Jesus says, every day. They are so close to one another, and yet somehow so far away from one another. And this idea then gets instantiated in the afterlife somehow, or at least as Jesus describes it. There is set between them a great chasm. That idea in the earthly life that somehow the rich man was physically separated, even though right next to the poor man. But even more so, that somehow the poor man's suffering was not his problem. That now becomes the symbol of the afterlife. That whereas, right, rich man was in the good place and Lazarus in the bad place, now in the afterlife, the tables are turned, or we might say, the scales have been rebalanced. That's what Abraham says. You had the good stuff in life, now Lazarus has the good stuff. But even more important is this idea of this great separation. It's almost, I think, the way we should read this as Jesus parodying the way we often think about poverty and those who are poorer than us, in the sense that we use all sorts of ways to create this chasm in our lives right now. When often we say, well, if only we could do that, if only we had this system, if only we would implement this idea, if only this and that, which isn't to say these aren't good ideas, or we shouldn't do that, we shouldn't work on it. The question for us is, to what extent do those ideas become, instead of the spurring to action for us, just an alibi? Just a way to say, you know what, that's too big and complicated, and I can't get involved in that. Reasonable ideas, real solutions that might actually relieve suffering on a large scale, so often become too big and too burdensome and too complex, too systemic and systematic, and we don't even know where to start. And so the chasm just gets even bigger and allows us all the more, even if we're not actually aiming to do that, to evade responsibility. Important to note also about who Jesus is talking to, that Jesus is not saying this parable to the other rich people living sumptuously with fine linen in their gated houses. He is talking to middle-class professionals and lower-class workers. He is saying this, and in a way, they're kind of given this opportunity to laugh at the rich man. Oh, how wicked these people are. But that is not the point. The point is for them to then reflect, to what extent am I also, with those who are less well off than even I am, as hard as I am, as hard as I find it to make ends meet, to what extent am I opening up this chasm? Here's the good news, though, folks. I've got a lot of it, actually. First, as I've said lots of times in the Bible, if we read the hellfire and the punishment and the wrath literally, if we think that God's anger is the kind of anger that leads to the destruction of creatures, we are seriously misunderstanding the God that's actually revealed in Scriptures. As an alternative to that, every time we encounter a story like this of eternal and intense punishment for something, that is Scriptures, that is the Spirit's way of saying, hey, pay attention to this. And if we have to use threatening language, we will. Let's hope we don't have to do that. But the point being that this is something God really, 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 really cares about. Really, right? That's the point of saying, using this dramatic language of punishment. And also, figuratively, as a matter of eternal punishment and eternal salvation, that what Jesus is talking about is a matter of our salvation. Our salvation is at stake in this, but not in the sense of who goes to the bad place and who goes to the good place, but salvation in that original meaning of healing and wholeness, the healing and wholeness of our very being, the healing of the ways in which we are actually split down the middle and separated from ourselves and from others and from all creation. That somehow something about poverty gets at what we need to do, what we need to be a part of, what we need to receive in order to have our true, deepest, created nature restored. So we can think of this chasm also as a self-inflicted wound in humanity. It's a wound that cuts right through our very souls. It's a wound that cuts through all of the relationships that God created us to have from the very beginning among ourselves. It's a wound that goes back mythically to the dawn of humanity. And if we study scientific history, we can see it goes back to the dawn of civilization. The ways in which those who have much have too much, and those who have little have way too little. And if that's true, if we believe Jesus, that this is a matter of our salvation, then doing things to address poverty is not an extracurricular activity. It's not the frosting of our otherwise fine standalone cake. It's not something we get to when we have the time. It has to be something that is essential to our work and our identity in this life. Because it's speaking to the fundamental nature of our reality, of our universe, of why we are here in the first place. That we are made for love and compassion. And whenever we separate ourselves from others, we ourselves are split open and wounded. So what does it look like then? What does it look like to heal the chasm with all of the complexity, all the social complexity you already named, into how poverty comes about and what might actually relieve it on big scale? What are we to do so that we don't actually end up making the chasm worse? These are just proposals. You ponder over them over the next week and let me know what you think. With this parable, I think number one is just accepting the call. Accepting the call that poverty is all of our problem. It's something we are all called to do something about in one way or another. It's not just for saints. It's not just for those who are called to be social workers or those who are called to lead nonprofit organizations. But somehow, in all of our various and different vocations, and you all have various and different vocations, are doing amazing things in your work and in your retirement even now, somehow we are invited to reframe all of that in terms of how can poverty, the suffering of poverty, the misery of poverty be relieved so that there are no more Lazaruses at our gates. Second thing I want to propose to you is that before we think about solving poverty, and I set you up for that, sorry about that, but it's often the way we talk about it, right? Instead of solving poverty, if we first come at it just in terms of rebalancing, right? Getting back to what Abraham says in this parable, this idea that if life is so out of balance, where those who have much have too much and those who have little have way too little, then God will restore that balance at the end of all things. And if we don't want that, then maybe we can do some rebalancing now. The idea that those who have much don't have too much, and those who have little don't have too little, some might call socialism. It's actually in the Bible. I'm sorry. It's Paul in 2 Corinthians, and it's also in Exodus. Rebalancing. Those who have too much don't have too much. Those who have little don't have too little. All for the idea of relieving the suffering and relieving the wound in humanity. The last thing I want to pitch to you, and it's a theme we're going to run with in October with our new spiritual growth series, where we're going to look at the practices of St. Francis, is again, because we can sometimes get caught up in the ideas, right? Whose ideas are better? Which party has the better platform? Who has the better ideology, right? And we get wrapped up in kind of armchair economics trying to do something about actually relieving suffering, is to put the ideas on hold and just start practicing something. Doing something that actually relieves suffering. Hey, we are about to do a pumpkin patch, aren't we? That pumpkin patch is entirely about raising money to feed hungry people. And we might get into all sorts of conversations about why those people are hungry to begin with, and maybe we should. And also, while we're having those conversations, people are hungry. So let's make sure that they're fed. Even just wrapping our head around that idea that let's do something first and then think about the bigger implications. The suffering itself demands a response from us. And that is the first step to crossing over and healing that wound within us and between us. And then finally, friends, number 4, not on here, is trust. Is to trust that what Jesus is talking about is true. To trust that these things are a matter of our created nature and our ultimate salvation. And that relieving misery wherever we can and as often as we can is the key to healing the deep woundedness within our very souls. Amen.